thereafter. So getting to know people in this world online, at least as a starting point. Yeah, so I'm really grateful for both of you. And Vanessa, I know Vanessa is like part of the broader sociology department here in UCT, but really grateful for having all three of you participate. It's really meaningful. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much for inviting. I'm really excited to hear from the others. And just in terms of order,
Sure.
Can we take? Are the others happy to go first, or what would you like?
So yeah. So I can suggest. I mean, I did suggest that structure. If you're okay with it. I mean, I don't mind. It doesn't. I'm just going to put it in the chat so everyone sees it. Sorry, I'm not at my usual desk, so it's a bit of looking around. So if that works, we could start. Or Kaya, if you want to start, I'm easy.
Okay.
I don't know if you have presentations or anything. You can, if you want to share the screen, you can. If you don't have to.
Okay. No, I'm happy to start. Although yeah, my understanding was that Parvati would start, but I'm quite happy to start. Unfortunately, I don't have a formal presentation, but I am, if you see my eyes wandering all over the place, I have some notes down here. So yes, just by a means of introduction, I'm Hayat Fakir. I'm hi Vessel. I'm at Stellenbosch University, and yeah, I'm very happy to share this discussion with you, Parvati, and of course Vanessa, whom I know from Stellenbosch. But just an indication maybe of my special interest in your work. I came across your work when I first started my PhD in the early 2000s and around migration and care, and was absolutely inspired by your work and your take on care and so on. So for me, it's such a pleasure, and I'm so grateful for Elena and her team for inviting me. So yes, very happy to be here and to engage with you, with your work, and so on. So I have suggested 2 readings, and I am thinking of as a background, as background readings, while I'm thinking of also expanding my own research in particular ways and so on. And I will assume that people have read the suggested readings. So I'm not going to go into much detail around the specific articles. But just to sort of highlight influences and where they make connections with what Parvati had or what we have read of Parvati's work, and hopefully you can make connections with this in terms of your own research. So for me, very much, and this is what the 2006 article demonstrates, is that my thinking and understandings of care emerged really from the social reproduction analysis framework. And the first, the 2006 article, then hones in really on the life of Maria Glamini, a woman who worked with me at Wits University, where I was based at the time. And her story, my time with her, provided me with a very valuable entry point into a whole network of care where just looking at her, focusing on my time with her, staying with her in Soweto, meeting people whom she was very closely connected to in terms of care and kinship relationships, to demonstrate in a sense how one person, very lowly paid, not able to access a social wage and so on, was at the center of a network of more than 10 people. But importantly for me, conceptually also for me at the time, was the understanding that how care spans different geographies which we broadly and sometimes superficially define as urban and rural. And that those linkages between urban and rural, which became so prominent during apartheid, still illustrated itself in the post-apartheid, post-colonial era. And it was really later when, when I started, when Nancy Fraser's work, which I see Parvati also draws on, a 2014 work on the hidden abode, where it was also much more explicitly linked to a specific form of capitalism, and how one can see these care relationships, as well as our connection to the environment and politics, as Fraser points out, operating in the hidden abode, that for me it was sort of, both a very welcome affirmation of how this thinking has developed in other parts of the world as well, but also strengthened my own understanding in looking at care from the social reproduction analysis framework. But
sorry, Kayat, I think you pressed mute. Sorry about that.
Oh,
there we go. Thanks.
Sorry.
No worries.
But Maria's story was also much more than this, right? It was about the complexity of love. And the complexity of love is both something which we understand in our everyday lives, but also often leave out in our analysis of care. Although, I mean, I'm certainly not, it's not a pioneering view to then highlight that how love plays this very complicated role in the ethic of care as well as the practice of care, being both a point of solace, a space of solace, and so on, but also imposing particular burdens and obligations on women and on people in different care relationships. So, but importantly, I felt also about that particular work was also then to look at and I'm trying to take this notion of love further in my current work, love around solidarity, politics, also about how love can contain elements of rage and care at the same time, and how it can provide us with a different kind of feminist politics, recognizing how it has a particular influence on our lives. But going back to Fraser a bit, and maybe where I'm currently located, I've recently been quite inspired by her work captured in Cannibal Capitalism. And this book came out in 2022, so last year, and I've only recently connected with it. And I think it's quite a a comprehensive, and in that sense, it goes into it necessarily tends to generalize view about how care is also pushed to the background in terms of our conceptual understandings and so on. But as the motor of capitalism taking on this cannibalistic character, that in a sense we are eating ourselves, right? And what is exciting for me about this is also how it includes an understanding of the impact of colonialism on not just social reproduction, but also how it continues colonialism in a different form, continues in the present day, and continues to consume care and social reproduction from the colonies. And I mean, excitingly for me was the fact that Fraser argues in this book that the dispossession of care is really the first move of colonialism, right? And linking it to some extent to decolonial theory, where some feminist decolonialists argue that the gendering of the colonies was really a first step in terms of colonialism and colonial moves and so on. So I thought very exciting work from her, as well as the proposals she has in terms of how we then deal with this the cannibal nature of capitalism and the state of the world as it is now. But for me, the value of Fraser was then also into extending my research, which came in a sense organically and speaks to the second reading I provided, into looking at the environment and ecological issues. And here also, just to talk about very recent inspirations, is the work of Maria Puig de la Balacasa, which talks about matters of care and has it illustrates sort of a materialist feminism understanding of our connections with nature. But what I especially like about it is this notion of reciprocity in terms of the environment. Certainly recently, in terms of ecological feminism, there has been this move towards viewing our planetary environment as less binary. I'm sure you know the debates of making a distinction between humans and nature, and that the debate has certainly moved to much more towards an understanding that we are nature, right? We are not separate from nature, that the divisions between us and the more than human is really yes, one can see an act of industrialization, an act of engaging in exploitation of our environment and so on. But certainly there has been a move towards viewing ourselves as nature, as Jackie Cox's work have demonstrated so clearly over most of her later career. But this notion of reciprocity for me also makes that link between that link to love actually quite strongly, I think. And Pugh de la Bellacasa argues that as much as we care for nature, nature cares for us as well, and that should be part of our ecological understanding, our ecological and feminist engagements. So, but in relation to care then, and I'm so excited also, Parvati, to see how in your work also you look at these materialities, the infrastructure of care, the physical space in which care is conducted. And when I then make the shift to the environment and say that it is organic, it's organic because this is what my research and my research participants led me to, in a reflection on how care operates in different classes. The actual physical infrastructure of the homes and the physical spaces in which care is conducted and received and redistributed has a severe impact on notions of quality of care and in my reflection on the physical space in which care is conducted, the participants I've been working with, and eventually I started working with movements, agricultural land movements, farm worker movements, and so on. It is really the reflection of these women on the physical spaces they find themselves that leads me to an ecological consideration. And in that reflection, one can also see this reciprocal relationship with nature. And in fact, I mean, women, for example, working on farms, women in the fishing industry, and so on, talk about the deep understanding, but also love for nature, how just like other relationships, it has this dual role in their lives, demanding much of them, but also reciprocating that kind of investment and nurturance that is given. And okay, sorry, I just lost my, but also sort of trying to grapple with what is then, if we say we are nature, is this responsibility for the more than human, is it innate, or how it is being informed and influenced by the landscapes which women occupy, right? And how class still intersects with natural landscapes, the value and the nurturance that women can expect from the natural environments if the materiality of the environment is so actually so contradictory to an ability to care, or the possibility, so rather the possibility of care when you're living on what was previously a mining dump, and the soil around you have been poisoned by previous mining activities or current mining activities, and how people struggle to include food sovereignty, nutritious feeding, etc., when they are replaced or dispossessed by big farms, industrial agriculture, and so on. So yeah, I'm gonna leave it there, and just to say that, you know, for me at this point in time, I think that the study of care and investment, the intellectual time spent in care has been immensely interesting and exciting, and I think there is still so much to be done, and that it is really, for me, it is really gratifying to see a group like yours, Elena, and in other parts of the world, but especially a group like you, who are reaching out to so many different points in our region, but also internationally, to promote and to further deepen the study of care. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I find that the most fascinating. You're almost like your intellectual journey, through your own intellectual journey, but also through time, where you've come over the last probably 20 years or maybe even more, I don't know, you know, from the early social reproduction framework, which still informs much of our work, moving into, you know, like you said, the geographies of care, the geohistories, as Parvati describes it, of care, but then moving us to your more recent, I suspect, work, or the continuation of that work, and thinking of, and particularly actually I like your link to love, you know, in the way in which effective ties play out in how we care, not just as a practice, but very much as a political kind of action, or not, but also as a value, and what how it shapes, you know, what we can do, how we can do it, but also how we're made to think about it, particularly with colonial histories, and the gendering, as you mentioned, of the colonies. So I really appreciated that. And then as you moved us through into, you know, your eco-feminist approach to understanding the ideas around reciprocity between caring for nature and nature caring for us, what we see in our work more and more as we move away from pure urban centres, also into more rural environments, but not only in rural environments either. So I really am very grateful for that very rich and beautifully articulated. I literally was captivated and held by every word that you shared. So thanks so much. I'm going to hand over to Parvati and Vanessa, if you want to spend a few minutes, you know, commenting in discussion with Kayat in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. So Thank you so much, Kat. That was just absolutely brilliant. And I do have 3 or 4 slides really just to kind of talk me through it, but also hopefully to help people to kind of follow what might otherwise appear somewhat like chaotic thoughts. But actually, first, I'd like to stop and just say thank you so much to Kat for both her papers as well as the talk today. It was just, the paper was inspiring because as it happens, I've been writing at the moment what is a series of 3 or 4 papers actually on the first one is called Decolonizing This, Decolonizing That, and is a critique of the kind of rhetorical decolonization in some of migration studies. The second one looks at anti-colonial nationalism and anti-colonial thought actually, and what you can learn from anti-colonialism. And I'm kind of interested in that series of work in the context of what it means for the nation. The third one is on whiteness and solidarity, and then the fourth one is actually a bigger theoretical piece. But what is important for me is the reason I say this is some of this is about a critique of decolonization. And then I read Kat's paper and I thought, this is an academic who actually does decolonial work and has done it without having to call it decolonial, because this is the stuff of, it's grounded politics in your own institution. And I've been saying this to people, you don't decolonize epistemes and, decolonize the ground on which you stand, right? That's your first starting point. So, you don't have to talk about as some people have done in migration studies or in gender study. They say, oh, we can decolonize migration studies or gender studies by looking at Lugonas's work. Yes, you can, but why don't you just start by looking around you and thinking, what's the change I'm responsible for, right? And to me, that was the brilliant part of those papers, right? It took that ground seriously. So, as you know, for me, locating care is a really important political imperative. And it comes from questions rather than answers. And it's very much in that vein that I just sort of wanted to highlight a few things as well. So I also really love the point about love, and I have maybe been sitting there and making extensive notes from what you said. So thank you so much for your talk, and it's just amazing. So a few points, and very quickly, what is it that I've been trying to do? I have been trying to think about what is the content of care. And I think looking at the sort of papers, at the special issue that you have put together, what it made me think is these are really important categorical questions, right? And I'm really unconvinced that care is the same thing everywhere. Because and particularly in the race and feminist care ethics, I was really trying to push that to the limit and say, can you call it the same thing if for some people actually killing your child is care, right? So I really wanted, I have been concerned that care is very much seen as a all-win situation, right? And when is it not something that everybody wins at? And really trying to push the care ethicists, I suppose, to think about that while still trying to imagine a kind of a normative framework, right? So what are the dissonances in care, right? When is it that some people, and that's kind of been sort of my historical interest, if you like. And of course, as part of that is inheritances. What are the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial historical legacies influencing care? And then the third one is systems, which is what is care embedded in, and articulations, what does it articulate with? And I thought maybe systematizing that is some of what you have been trying to do as well in your family caregiving project. Because you look at different contexts of care, content, but also inheritances. I think the political economy and the systems of care across the countries that you are looking at, but also the different spaces. And this comes out both in Kayat's work, but also in the work of this group, is the differences between different places. And I really like that relational element to it, because we often theorize capitalism in this kind of global north-south ways. And what you were trying to do is to actually put it into local circuits of capital and look at those local circuits within global circuits. And I thought that was really important, actually, because I'll come back to that. For me, that's becoming something increasingly interesting, is the role of different places. And then finally, what does it articulate with? So I've been thinking a little bit about, so if care is different in different places, but gender is also different in different places, race is also different in different places, class is different in different places. So how do you mix up the categorical differences with the in care, with the categorical differences in the other things with which it articulates, including capitalism? And so that was kind of one of the, this has kind of been some things that I got from reading your works. And I particularly, like I said, really like the kind of, the regional articulations. And I think the regional articulations are really crucial in the Southern African context, given the way in which production systems were based upon these kinds of very variegated regionalism. Both through, the way the mining was involved, but Bantustan. So there was a political economies to these kind of notions of territory, right? And that also includes, and really interesting about the notion of the domestic, right? So what becomes the domestic territory in each of your cases was really different, because it could be something about domestication of particular territories by putting that into the context of local forms of production compared to the domestic as a space of the home. And that being, where certain forms of social reproduction are made possible or even enforced. And then the kind of extraction of value from those kind of domestic spaces, whether that is the Bantustan, and actually the creation of this as a kind of a domestic space, right? So I really got a lot of those ideas from your work about, and it's something that I would, I hope it's useful for you to talk about that as well. So for me, those were really big and really important insights from the work that you were doing. So I think there are three other things then. Is it changed on my, yeah. So this is the thing that I've been thinking about, and this really spoke to what Kayat was talking about, which is about care and affect. And I was really interested also from all your work in thinking through, the case of Maria in particular was very interesting, because there was a really mixture of three things. That is, there's a notion of duty in care. There's a notion of reward, and there's also affect. And I think the duty is a kind of more of a normative framing, right? And it is that the right thing to do, right? Whereas the rewarding could be seen as within certain versions of political economy, right? That it is rewarding because either in the present or as a legacy. And it also offers different types of rewards. So I could see, for instance, that say in Maria's case, you were talking about this, the aunt, and then the aunt who's got the two children, and then one of the children has got twins. What is the, what is the kind of questions around legacy that raises? Does that mean like these twins might be looking after them in the future? Is it that you have built up some kind of a social capital in this context, or has that aunt developed, or is it just even inheritance of money? Or what happens when there is no money to inherit? What is the basis on which any version of a reward is conceptualized, right? So it did make me think about the complexities of this is both as, first the normative thing and then the rewarding thing, which could be seen as a more political economy. But I think especially in the talk, which is kind of not there so much in Kat's papers, but much more in her talk today, is the role of affect. And both, and I would love to hear more about how you see this in the context of your projects on family caregiving, which is what are the kind of antagonisms, sorrows, but also joy and laughter. And I'm really interested in, I actually did not think of love, but I think the ambivalence of love, not the ambiguities, but the ambivalence, the fact that it is multi-valued, is something which it was something I really took away from Kayat's talk today as well. But I think I really want to come back to something about joy and laughter, because I think what social reproduction theory often does is misses that moment, those moments of joy and laughter, which perhaps we could return to. And I think for the family caregiving project, what's really interesting is, is this joy and laughter the same when you're looking after older people rather than young children? And it links back to kind of notions of the social investment state, where actually looking after the young, like the state often invests in childcare, but not in older care, because the childcare is ultimately going to the production of the next labor force. Whereas older people, what is their economic role, right? They probably don't have an economic role. But how does that translate into notions of care? And I do see this sometimes, like, for instance, my sister really enjoys her grandchild, but does she enjoy her looking after her mother-in-law the same way, right? Do love and care, does the question of joy and laughter come up in the same way, right? And that's been kind of really something I've been thinking about, because it's really you have to stretch it when a child behaves in an unknowing way, right? So-called. It's always really funny, and she'll send videos and stuff like that. But then it's never seen as such fun. So what does loss of ability compared to the ability to have ability in the future, right? So the ability to be a cognizant, knowledgeable person in the future as they grow up is always filled with promise, right? Whereas with older people, it is that cognizance is lost rather than to be gained in the future. So there's something here about anticipatory logics which really affect affect and what is enjoyable. And for me, that was something that it raised some interesting questions for me. How do you still care in the same way? And maybe this is because of my age, so I'm kind of struggling with this myself. But it's something which is very much present in my life at the moment. So with both my mothers here in the house, so it is. And I think also something about expectations and monitoring. I think there is something there about expectations and monitoring, which perhaps both the papers, I would love to hear more thoughts about that, in that children probably expect less and do not monitor, whereas parents would. Like they will say, well, you didn't care for me like this, or you should do this way. So there's something there about that which influences the differences between different forms of care. And these are just really personal reflections, but I hope that they do something for the analysis in the future. And then finally, I heard a set of questions, which I am really puzzling over at the moment, which is The first of them is value of thinking about social reproduction rather than care. And I've been thinking about the COVID was really interesting, and I had an opportunity to comment on the care manifesto. And I think in that, I returned to kind of the notion of social reproduction and how actually what COVID was about social reproduction and not so much about care, because people who would not normally be seen as care workers were key workers. So for instance, people who were, empty the bins or so on. So they're not seen as part of care, but they were really crucial as key workers. So it really it forced social reproduction completely back on the agenda, but very quickly lost. And the speed at which that loss occurred has been astounding, right? So there has been no long-term recognition of social reproduction. In fact, if anything, the speed of that loss has been greater. And that's a question that I'm wondering, why is it that we could lose this so quickly? And also how do we then conceptualize that in relationship to care? The second question that and I got a lot of this from both your pieces differently, is the relationship between care and production. And Kayat, I think you're kind of subdued about it because your paper is not focused on this, of course, at that point. But what I really thought about was academic production, right? And academic capitalism as concepts which run through that kind of WITS examples, and its relationship to social reproduction. So we never think, and this is why I really thought that was such an important decolonial initiative, because it forces us who read this to think about who's working for us. And it also makes us realize that we might be seen as the capitalists here, right? Because we are completely milking off the profits of this by having clean spaces in which to produce certain versions of capital. What is capital in this instance then? I also have a question for you all. Is care local? And I think in your piece on your special issue, you mentioned the kind of differences between Fiona Robinson's piece and mine. And I can see that what she's talking about, that this is a relational ethic, but I still want to hold out the possibility that actually there can be a complete difference. And I think for me, there are three ways in which you can think about this locality. One of them is there's a version of universalism, that care is the same. It is a universal thing. The second one is that actually care is currently defined through certain versions of Eurocentrism, but it could be done otherwise. And the third one is really thinking about it much more as actually what is care locally. And I still think that there's a need for us to do a lot more work like what you people have been doing, to think about local care, and then using that to challenge something like, not to challenge, but to change things like care ethics, and what to me still looks like an implied universality. And that's why I really wanted to push this notion of care to the kind of its limits, and to think, when is dying care? When is killing somebody care? And does feminist care ethics have a place for that kind of total, I'll come back to that. The fourth thing is care. And I really wanted to kind of get us to think a little bit about simultaneity, hierarchies, and losses. So in Kayat's piece, but also in some of the other pieces, that you all have written, what I really picked up was this kind of, having to care for multiple people at the same time, but also what it does to your self-care. Because if you could just care for one person followed by another person, it's less confusing in my head at any rate. It's when everybody needs care simultaneously, which makes it really complicated. But because it also forces upon you as to how to hierarchize care. When if you are not able to do it simultaneously, right? So you're having to make choices. And I think there's something here to be done about thinking about simultaneity, hierarchies and losses in terms of care ethics, but not just on care practices. And finally, I wanted to ask you about what about the non-relational? Those who either you have no relations with, but also does care mean breaking off from certain kinds of relationships because otherwise it leads to harm. And I think for me, those are the big questions that sometimes feminist care ethics don't have to deal with, because it still looks at care as from a virtuous and not from a situation of virtuosity rather than adequately from the position of vulnerability. So I think those are my questions to you, is that from your own works, what would you, what can you tell me about, what are your views about this? So yeah. Thank you so much. And sorry, I think I've gone slightly over time.
Thank you so much, Parvati. You've absolutely not gone over your time. The richness and the depth, the conceptual, and never mind theoretical, but the conceptual connections that you're making, not just, to this context, but, across the papers, but at a level of practice and ethics is just of a magnitude that I've probably never seen. So I'm, that's phenomenal. And I really appreciate the time, obviously, and the effort you've taken to do that work. Whilst looking after your parents. Yeah, needless to say. I actually really enjoyed the novelty of hearing about thinking through the difference between, looking after different categories of people, older people versus, and what that does. But your introduction of this idea of loss of ability versus the ability for the future, having long-lasting past relationships, perhaps, and what that does to your current practice of care and thinking around care. But equally, the joy and the laughter. We, particularly in this program, are very particular about bringing out the positive joy and laughter that comes with care, that we've seen in very still constrained conditions, still, and not always seen, particularly a caregiver as an adult daughter who has given up employment through an economic or even a particular lens, that there's choices being made, and there's so there's quite a lot of that we are seeing on the ground here, at least in South Africa and in the region. The other thing I particularly would love to speak to is the legacies that you mentioned, the building up of social capital, the kind of idea of reward, that and that's come out quite strongly recently in our work around the metaphysical. So whilst whether it's spirituality, but also as you pass, particularly for older persons, as they begin to think about passing, but though caregivers for older persons, about what that might mean for them as their parents pass and potentially become ancestors, and all the links to that, where we haven't even begun to think through it, but that thinking is really we really appreciate that. There's so much. It's like on every comment you make, everything was resonating what we're seeing, and the ideas around, I too agree that so much more needs to be done with thinking about the locality of care, but not just as a place, but what the meanings of care in the local context, and how that can, as you say, change care ethics, not necessarily challenge it, but work in ways of thinking around it, as you mentioned yourself, like care from a position of vulnerability, but in particular with particular geohistories of care infrastructure, and all that. Now I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna hand over maybe perhaps to Kaya and Vanessa to add and comment. But I really appreciate that. Thank you, Parvati.
Yeah, absolutely agree, Elena, that the comments and the questions were so rich and absolutely inspiring, and so on, and maybe possibly not enough time for us to respond to it, but definitely food for thought. I wanted to sort of talk about respond in two ways, and maybe by looking at age, right? Age and expectations and relations. Maybe cover some of the other points also, but I really appreciate you bringing the age of carers, you know, in terms of generational, where they fit into in terms of generations, as carers, care recipients, however we want to phrase that. And the other one is to talk about, you know, just the complexities of love and care and death and all of that. So firstly, I mean, here in both my responses, I'm going to focus a little bit on the work I did for my PhD, which by its nature is sort of much more in-depth and so on. But when my PhD question was, who cares when the women migrate, right? In a very patriarchal society where women, especially what we would call the middle generation, the mothers, when they are the migrants, whether internationally or domestic migration and so on. And when I started off with this research in a particular community, and I spoke to some people in, you know, local government and so on, and like, the response to me was, this isn't a question, right? Because the answers are obvious. Gogos care. Now, gogos is a colloquialism for grandmothers. You know, that gogos care and so on. And in a way, this relates to the social role of, or social expectations of grandmothers, but also in South Africa, the specificity of the economic role of older people, where our social policy actually is geared materially much more towards older people, where the a what do you call it, social grant for older people is quite significant in its amount, but also considered through research to have quite a significant impact. It's spread quite widely beyond just the individual recipient. So in other words, it's shared, right? And in that sense, older people who do get the old age pension, they play quite a strong economic role, to the extent where their money goes much further beyond them, and they could even be the victims of violence to get access to that money and so on. So there is a very different economic role, I think, or specific economic role played by older people, but also this expectation about the social role they play as your substitute carers, and less than the recipients of care. So that actually also goes to your point about the localities of care and the geographical context and specificities of care in. But so for me, the question was then, but what happens when grannies or gogos don't want to care or can't care, or they themselves are the migrants, right? And obviously, as one would expect from people in local government. This was just too smooth an answer, and so on. In addition to the one, oh no, our women don't care. I mean, our women don't migrate. In other words, they understand that their natural role is in the household. But I think also what is important about age is considerations of age and expectations around this, is that what my research also showed was that children also care, right? That if that an embedded understanding of care needs to, and in the South African context, need to look at children-only households as well. And I mean, that would be also a comment and both a question also to you, Parvati. If one, if the one wants to extend your research from the north to the south, how does one develop, or how does one create the same kind of embeddedness that local researchers have? And the example for me is with child-headed households, right? They are hidden to a great extent because they don't want to come to the notice of welfare officials and so on, because then they will be broken up, right? And then there is a different form of care, and one can talk about the quality, but if one looks at all the our broader understandings about care, there is care being conducted there, right? So the notion of age in itself needs to, and care needs to be complicated in different localities, but also implies that one needs to be embedded within a certain environment before certain aspects of care, which you don't want the authorities to know about, right? Before that can be revealed. So how does a geographer from the north, for example, embed themselves to the same extent? Should they? And what is the relationship then between northern and southern researchers in relation to localized and localities of care? So that's the one question I would pose to you, and by way of a response. But then just briefly, and I'm gonna stop then, and Vanessa would, I'm sure, want to participate as well. But also then in relation to children-only households, was what came up in my own research was abortion, right? And it's a very sort of sad story of how this person tried to access legally legal abortion services, right? And to access the right to an abortion, and all kinds of social expectations and norms prevented the person from access legal services. But also how an abortion and the death of a child is seen as the opposite of care. Whereas for this person, it was, for her motivation for an abortion was care and love for her other siblings, and so on, and an understanding of her own ability to care, and so on. And I think it is a very important element that you bring into this notion of care and violence being, in a sense, what one could call superficially violence, is very important right? It has implication also for more than human studies. Just yesterday, we had a very interesting researcher from Egypt who looked at the care of animals or what she calls non-human animals who are destined for slaughter and resale, and how one can't see this as a dichotomy, right? The eventual death of these animals and the care which goes into it, and that death doesn't necessarily negate the care which is given. At actually the care that is given to those animals endures because of, for example, the quality of the meat that you eventually consume or sell, and so on. But yes, just I'm going to stop there. But just thank you very much for really drawing out these themes and asking us to think about it.
Thanks, Kaya. Parvati, would it be okay if you held on responses to those and we bring in Vanessa? Because I'm watching the time. Hi, Vanessa, and please share share with us. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena. Thank you so much to the team as well for extending the invitation. I'm definitely going to start off by giving both of you your flowers, as the cool kids say. I'm so grateful for your text. Really, it got me thinking a lot about the work that I'm doing now, collecting my data on the project I'm working on, which is on Black middle class families in kind of northeastern South Africa in a place called Mbombela. And really considering family obligations over 2 generations of the Black middle class, which is an interesting but also very difficult to define group of people. But anyway, so I really appreciated, I mean, so much from the readings that you both shared. I mean, Khayat, really, Maria's Burden is such a great text. Honestly, I don't think that can be ever stated. It's like, yes, this is the one. Especially in thinking about a social reproduction as having its base in the expectation and obligation of care, and how one might how one might think about that, not only in, of course, like theorizing care, but also how participants themselves think about themselves as caregivers and care receivers, and what the value of that is for themselves, their communities, their families, and so on. And this stood out for me particularly because it helped me also reflect on Parvati's point that she brought up just recently about the question of reward. In my project, I'm really interested in looking at Ubuntu, and how Ubuntu is in some way like a really foundational ethic of care, obligation, responsibility, and shaping kinship for the families that I'm looking at. But what is interesting as well, which is what I suspect, but some interesting developments have happened since starting to collect the data, but is what I suspected initially was that there has to be more to it, and this makes me think a little bit more about the question of cannibalism. But what I suspected initially was that, and this was inspired by a text I read, is that the question of personhood and how African philosophy frames the acquisition and completion of personhood really complicates the idea of thinking about Ubuntu as kind of only this what shall I call it, kind of utopian way, right, of understanding relations and exchanges, so to speak. And and that the question of fulfillment of personhood, of course, isn't just about what one or how one is regarded in the here and now. It also is about what happens on the other side of the grave. So it's a big question in that way, and it has become very interesting just listening to some of my participants. I mean, I'm thinking about my interview that I had yesterday, which is very fresh in my mind, but I woke up this morning still really not sure what to do or think about it. And it took me back to Parvati's section in the one text on care as risk, and maybe there's something to be said here about that section, care as risk, and you're thinking, Hayat, about the complexity of love. Maybe it's also love as risk, you know. But the question of there's a section where Parvati, you write, you know, feelings of obligation, burden, and frustration can be distorting and fracturing, you know, for care. And I thought to myself, this is really interesting. What if in localizing how we think about care here in South Africa, in Bombela, where I am, what if it isn't actually distorting or fracturing, or maybe at least what if it coexists with indebtedness and necessity? So I really started to think about that very seriously, and that took me down a bit of a rabbit hole, because what I've also noticed, and what has started to come out in some of the interviews that I've had, is that there is something to be said about violence, abuse, unemployment, and trauma that for some reason is in one way or another associated with care, or even the obligation to care. So my participant yesterday said to me, I asked her quite blatantly, why did you, you seem really moved by, so she lost her mother, and I said, you seem really moved by this, and of course, understandably, losing a family member is not easy and whatever. And so she was telling me why this is, but she ended up really saying to me, I watched my mother live before her divorce. So her parents got divorced when she was about 8th grade. So that's maybe like 13, 14. And she said, I watched my mother live her life in constant fear of my father because he was physically abusive. And to me, everything, and this is her, and she's saying everything that motivated anything I wanted to do for her, the way I wanted to care for her, was because I had seen her suffer that much. So, I'm still sitting on that a bit, but I've heard this as well with a different participant who had said, the same thing. For her, she was in an abusive relationship, and so instead of that motivating her obligations towards her parents, it motivated how she wanted to care for her children, so that they would never be in a situation, or at least the best you could, not find themselves in a situation where they were in abusive relationships or whatever. They always knew that, home was safe, and so I found that really interesting. And that also brings me back to Hayat's thinking about physical space, the physical space of home, and what that permits and what that limits in terms of how we conceptualize, theorize, and think about or document the practice of care, and maybe even like the underlying obligation or ethic to care. So I thought, sorry. So I've been thinking a little bit as you were both speaking, and I'm so grateful really for this engagement about what we can do with that, and if our theorization of care ethics can make room for trauma, physical abuse, and those kinds of difficulties. Then I think, I don't think there's anything else I'd like to say on that, except perhaps to end off by also just maybe inviting some thinking with me, if you would so indulge me. Two last things really is, the first one is, and I think Parvati really started to speak to this, Hayat yourself as well, on the question of, thinking about different generations. So I'm looking at two generations within the same family. And, I'm looking at a parent and an adult child, and thinking about how, not only about how they conceptualize care and how they practice care, and what motivates that, of course, but also whether or not, whether or not something like physical trauma or physical abuse translates across generations as a base for care. And then finally, what do we do with the idea of, or notion of, self-care? Really, how do we think about that can we, I mean, is there something to be said in terms of that? Is it a trope? Is it something to be taken seriously in its implications? And I mean, also, I mean, with Ubuntu, for instance, there is a temptation to immediately assume it will create some kind of tension, right? Because, you know, if at face value, it seems as if it is geared towards kind of like selfishness, self-centeredness, and so on and so forth, which is pretty much antagonistic to the tenets of Ubuntu. But I think there's definitely more than that. I think that is a quite simplistic or limiting to think about it as simply that. And I think it possibly might actually be a misconceptualization of it, or misdefinition. So yeah, I'm very curious to hear what you both think. And again, thank you so much for the work that you continue to do. It's really inspiring and really insightful.
Thanks, Vanessa. Really appreciate that. And also the ending points around self-care is yeah. I'll hand over to our guest speakers. Parvati, if you want to yeah, respond or comment on what we've been hearing. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to hear about your thesis, Vanessa, and for your comments, Kat. Again, you know, it's really provoked a whole lot of thought. You know, the thing about actually passing and care beyond the grave is something which, and the metaphysical is not something I had thought about. So I that was also your comments, Elena. So I really, it's really, I never thought about this in the context of the metaphysical. And I think it does raise a question of actually the relationship between spirituality, religion, and care, which perhaps liberal care ethicists in the North often eschew taking up questions of religion into this, because they want to produce their normative outside in secular spaces. But actually, at least in Africa, and possibly in many other parts of the world, but I'm not sure that really translates, because I think the normative is so closely tied to certain versions of spiritual, which also has its own legacies, right? It's also got the legacies of its colonial heritage and variations across place and, you know, denominations and so on. But thinking now, because I have this project called Decolonizing Education for Peace in Africa, which is currently working in 14 countries. And this also goes some way towards answering your question, Kat, is that it is very complicated. I think I don't know if I'm a Northern scholar or not. I'm never quite sure, but I think definitely I come with some funding from the global North and some institutional advantages and disadvantages of being located in the global North now. But in our project, it's a Network Plus project. So we fund projects in the global South to do their own thing. They can decide, we help them to come up with a decolonial project of their own. We give them lots of training. We help them with ideas also if they want to. But then we give them the funds and then they can just run it however they like. They do have some things that they have to do, which is we are committed to open access of the outcomes. So we want all the data to be put, though the data belongs to them, and they are welcome to put it up on their own websites or portals, because we have the ability to put it up in a long-lasting portal. We do ask for the data to be put so that we can, and to be formatted in a particular way so that we can put it up on our portal. This, of course, leads to real big problems, because people still think, oh, we've given you the data. What more do you want? I say, I never wanted the data. The data belongs to you, right? But you still need to kind of work on it and publish from it. And then that bit is fine. A lot of the people really find it hard to translate. And similarly, they say, well, we've done all this for you. And I said, now you think of it the other way, right? Supposing you think of it that, so we say, can you tell us what you've done? Oh, we've told you what we've done that for you. We've given you a report. I said, no, instead of thinking of it like that, why don't you think of it as we have the capacity and the money to advertise some of your work, and you tell us what you want us to advertise of yours, right? And we will act as your publicity agents for free. So if you think of it that way, then it flips the kind of responsibility and power a little bit, in that we are committing to doing things for you, right? And in some senses, I think the GCRF projects need to work on that basis. I think the people in the Global South need to kind of, but it's very difficult because that's not the inheritance of the research relationship, right? And it is almost impossible to turn it around in one generation. So the question is, how much of this can you do? The second thing about this Global North and Global South, which comes out of a slightly different part of the same project, is we decided then to use some of the teaching materials, the research materials from Cameroon, to develop teaching about Cameroon, global inequalities and climate change in the North, right? There's a story to be told about the issues with that, but I'm not going to say that here. But the thing that we did as part of that, which is also a little extension funding we got, is to develop some teaching materials for Cameroonian teachers. And so there are three things to be said. First of them is complete lack of knowledge of ours in terms of what the textbooks are, right? And the politics of producing textbooks and how they relate. So for instance, if you have a textbook, it has a lot of power, and because sometimes the people who've written the textbooks have given money to the local government to have their books as the textbooks. So both the ministry and those authors will really reject any attempts to produce supplementary materials within that context. So you have to be aware of the politics of what is the text, and how those articulate the role of pedagogic inspectors, for instance, in checking through those. But also the fact that textbooks themselves change. Having said all of that, the thing that I really thought we contributed in this was three things. One of them is we focused on learning design, which is a movable thing, feast, right? It is the fact of who is your student and who's your teacher, right? And how do you sensitize yourself to those kinds of forms of location and what that means for what education means. And I think that can be generally applied. And we have actually done a project with UNISA for a long period where we've run these courses across multiple countries. And whenever we go, particularly Ashley, who also at UNISA, who delivers this really well as well, is people always say, oh, why don't you just take this up as a career? It's such an important thing. So there's something here about pedagogic practice and localization, which can be a framework of localization. But actually, what is the local and what is its content can be filled in differently in different places. But it's a form of sensitization to what the localization could be and how pedagogic practices can therefore change. The second thing, which is a slightly different thing, is that actually when we talked about this climate change, what we found was that people said, well, actually, the reasons for climate change are pastoralism and overpopulation. And what we did was actually to say, no, it's global inequalities, the fact that there's a lot of consumption in the North, that actually American children contribute so much to climate change compared the histories of carbon colonialism, all of those sorts of things. It is a tricky thing. First of all, it at one level, it really helps to kind of stop people blaming pastoralists, right? Which may be the good part of it. But the much more ambivalent part of this is you tell them that actually you are really victims of this kind of carbon colonialism and that you're suffering climate change, but actually the beneficiaries are elsewhere. What does it leave those people with, right? Anger, but with no solutions, right? So is this an ethical thing to do? I'm not 100% sure about this. But it did raise the question of what does a Northern scholar do? It can lead to some form of blame taking in the Global South, right? Which may be an ethical practice, or if it is accompanied by some forms of reparation, perhaps not otherwise. Yeah. So there are, I think, limited roles for global Northern scholars. One of them may be funding as a form of reparation. The second thing is certain forms of perhaps pedagogic practices that we have developed, perhaps sometimes jointly, which might be transferable. I don't know if it is transferable, but it can be modulated. So I do believe that actually one can think about circulating knowledges rather than north-south transfers. So I do think there are things in the north that are really useful in the south. And I do think that there are elements of decolonization which get this wrong. I think this kind of wholesale critique of both modernity, and this was the bigger theoretical paper which I'm working on, which and I think it relates to these notions of modernity, is that so if you ask your older people or your families whom you're working with, how many of them do not want the benefits of modernity, right? So, so how far are aspirations not tied to that? They're not tethered to it only, they're tethered to other things as well. But you never see people saying, actually, we don't want all these benefits of, whatever the modern is. Yeah. And that leads to a question of what is the modern, but holding that apart. I think a wholesale critique of modernity for me doesn't work at this point. And that's kind of that's my experience from the global south. I don't see anybody say we don't want any of these things. I see most people say we want most of those things, right? Are they all wrong? How can we not take their aspirations seriously, right? And is it decolonial to just overthrow all those things? Yeah, to me, it isn't. You have to, decolonial means working from the grounds of where people are at, right? Not always just imagining an ideal form. Right. So anyway, so it may be, maybe I'm wrong, and I'm happy to be, I would love to hear more about that. So I do think there are things that that what is seen as European scholarship is useful for. And this also really became, it is also to recognize the extent to which we are all modern subjects, right? It is quite disingenuous for us to think that we are not, right? And you see Chinua Achebe's book, and you think about that moment where, where the death, how twins are killed, and, that sort of thing. How many of us are willing to go back to any versions of that form of pre-coloniality, right? We are not. So the pre-colonial is not necessarily an ideal form. Right? So there's a lot more going on in this kind of relationship between modernity, coloniality, and I think recognizing those versions of the modern and the aspirational in all of us makes it's much more complicated relationship between the North and the South, which is not to say that all of those modern arises from the North. It doesn't, right? So I think there are versions of the modern, and we have all the literature on the alternative modernities and all these other things which we can also draw on. And I think, therefore, and I think actually taking the materialities of people's lives seriously means that there is a relationship with the modern which has to be rethought away from the kind of work that Mignolo and all do, which is just a wholesale critique. Because the materialities of people's life, most people are struggling with very basic things, right? Access to really the very basics of what is seen to be a modern life. How can you take that away from, and are these people giving up all those things? I don't see in Mignolo, giving up all these things. I don't. And I'm not prepared to give it up. If I'm not prepared to give, why am I asking, why am I kind of holding up something as an ideal achievement, right? Or at least recognize that it is a more complex. So I think it's a long answer to a short question. What is the relationship between the North and the South? Is I think solidarity is perhaps the biggest thing, and really recognizing, and reparation and restitution has to be part of this, but also really recognizing the possibilities of global thinking for addressing local issues, right? Where people are considered are victimized for what is often not their fault. And I think that sort of a global thinking can help to spread blame. And I think there is a role for Northern scholars in that. Yeah, I don't know that. Yeah, I'm sorry, I've taken a lot of time to.
No, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you, and also about our aspirations for, or expectations of, what modernity can deliver. If I made a note of this in a different relation, in relation to another point, but if we think about what about care, for example, in a context where you have to share a toilet with 300 other people, right? Or without a functioning sewage system, or house water available to your family, and so on, then it's very rich of others who are more privileged to then expect people to not tie into those kinds of materialities and so on. I think our time is also running out, and so on. And Parvati, I'd really like to read your work on decoloniality, because I'm equally frustrated by this sort of, I'm going to be less discreet about it, and almost this building up of Monyolo and Escobar and so on, in actually quite unfeminist ways, right? As these gods of decoloniality and so on, with very little connection to sort of working class concerns, influences of racial construction and so on in post-colonial societies. But Vanessa, I mean, absolutely exciting project and so on. And I'm sorry, but I can't give you sort of very focused responses to your questions and so on. But to say that, you know, this honing in on trauma as, you know, implicated in care relations is absolutely very exciting, right? And also looking at trauma in the perspective in relation to unemployment and those kinds of thinking is absolutely essential. Of course, you know the work of Phumla Gaboro-Madikizela, who talks about sort of generational trauma around race, right? Around racism and so on. And it may be interesting to look at that as one kind of way of thinking about how trauma is reproduced and implicated in care and so on. And just to say that academics, and especially feminist academics, are immensely unable to think about self-care in any sort of coherent manner, right? We argue for it, and we argue strongly that those who care that self-care is absolutely essential as well. But I don't know of really any work that deals with this in any comprehensive manner and so on. And I think it's important. I think it's also, there's a slight guilt to this, you know, I'm privileged, I'm middle class, I'm so on. There's so much else that I can do. This is indulgent and so on. But also how universities sell self-care as the solution to sexism in the university. And for example, if women speak out and Black women speak out in this university, what's the response from your transformation office or other offices? We're having a wellness day, right? Wellness considered in this very superficial manner and so on. And I think, but that doesn't mean, of course, that it's not an area of serious intellectual engagement and so on. Yeah, so thanks for the time, Elena, and Vanessa, your comments, and Parvati. I remember